Okay, we're happy to welcome Ryan Pankau tonight. And as Diane said, he's going to tell us about the trees and shrubs of Central Illinois. I know I couldn't wait till I got my order form, and I sent it that very day, so I was excited about it. So I hope you will become enthusiastic tonight when you hear about some of those treasured trees and shrubs. Ryan has over 2 decades of experience as a forester and an arborist, and he has said that fits right in with his career and his lifelong love of trees. So we're anxious to hear about that tonight. He's going to talk about the urban environment and some of the challenges that we have in planting those trees and shrubs. He will go into a little more detail about each one of them, so maybe you'll get excited about that and say, I have to have that. He also has experience in forest restoration and management, and now really concentrates on the care of trees in an urban setting. So he's going to tell you a little more about himself. So welcome, Ryan. We're happy to have you.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Kathy. And as she mentioned, I have experience as an arborist and a forester. So what are those 2 different things? Well, as an arborist, I looked at, that was the first job I kind of had out of college, and looked at individual care of an individual tree in your yard. That's the one plant, or maybe the one of few that we have, that we do anything and everything to save, right? So we'll take care of those as best we can, versus as a forester, I looked at those a stand of trees and a forest as an ecosystem, and managed those plants as a community and looked at more of an ecosystem perspective. So tonight I hope to kind of talk to you all about some of my favorite trees and shrubs off this tree and shrub list. So I'll cover kind of a list of plants and some of the things that I think are most important about them. But I bring to you that perspective of somebody that's planted them in an urban environment, has managed them individually, has managed them as an ecosystem. And I hope to kind of tie some of that together tonight so you can understand what this plant that may go in your yard, because I think a lot of us are probably planting trees and shrubs from this sale in our yard or on our property somewhere, what that can mean, what the ecological significance of that plant can mean for the wildlife around us, and how we can better support it with the things that we plant. So let's start by talking about just what makes a good urban tree. And here's kind of a short laundry list of that, but first off, it needs to be adapted to our climate, and there's a couple different ways we can look at that. Either its native status, that's what a lot of us in here are most interested in, but also the plant hardiness zones tell us that plant's relative adaptability to our cold, and I'll look at that a little bit on the next slide, but it needs to be adapted to urban conditions. And by urban conditions, I don't mean that pristine environment that the Bell Bowl Prairie was, that had all these microorganisms. If you look at this, that's a Dawn redwood, actually not a native tree, planted on U of I campus. It's safe to say that that planting location is not the same as it was back in the early days when that was probably prairie, or actually probably a savanna type setting. If you're not familiar with Champaign-Urbana, there's a big grove that we talk about that was a big stand of trees that kind of formed the community. This tree would have probably been, that's the location would have been on the edge of that, so probably kind of a savanna type setting. But when we build this building, when we pave things, when we plant turf, when we dig up all this soil, we change that environment massively. And so one of the biggest factors that urban trees need to deal with is that soil environment that's altered. So that's one of the things they need to handle. They need to handle increased heat from all that concrete and impermeable material that's around them, additional runoff, changes in water availability. So there's a lot of stresses we put on these plants that aren't the same as what they experience out in nature, so we do need some different things out of our native trees for them to be successful there. All of us in this room probably want a wildlife value, but let's face it, a lot of folks want ornamental appeal as well. And for some people, that's maybe the main selling point on some of these plants, is what's pretty to me as a human in this plant. But I will talk a lot tonight about that wildlife value and try to kind of show you what each one of the plants that I talk about, where do they fall in that in those categories of wildlife that might use them. With urban forests, we are concerned about diversity. So ideally you would plant something that would add to that diversity as opposed to be another plant that's the same as all the ones around it. And why do we care about that? We've learned some lessons from emerald ash borer, from Dutch elm disease, before that chestnut blight. The next big pathogen or insect that comes in can wipe out everything if we don't have a diverse urban forest. And I would say that a lot of the plants on this list are adding to that diversity. These aren't the run-of-the-mill things that we find at Lowe's or Home Depot or a big box store. So we're achieving that goal with a lot of these natives on this list. Shade or other benefits are also another thing that we want out of these plants. And by other benefits, that's everything down to even our mental health. We know that green spaces, if we live and work and go to school around a lot of green things, that helps us mentally. There's just a million different benefits that we want out of those plants. And finally, availability is a big factor. And I could tell you about some of the coolest, most rare native plants I've seen out in nature in a forest, but if you can't find that in a nursery or you can't find it at a local plant sale, that doesn't do you much good. So all the things that we're going to talk about tonight are relatively available species for the most part. So I talked about U.S. plant hardiness zones, and that's what this is showing us is the U.S. and then Illinois kind of broken down. And so we are actually zone 6 now. If you guys didn't realize that, a couple years ago, the zone maps changed and we gained a zone. But what these maps are based off of is our average coldest temperatures. So it's basically reflecting the cold of any area that you look at on the map. And that's changed. We've gotten a little warmer over time. Climate's changing. And so here's the difference. If you look at it, you can see kind of, here's where the line between 5 and 6 used to fall, and it's bumped up to here, and it's taken in a little bit of Chicago as well. This area around the lake's kind of grown. In 25 years, they're predicting that line will extend to the Wisconsin border. So we need to be thinking about this with our plant choices now, and that's why it's helpful to look at the relative zone hardiness of a plant that you select. If a plant's at the very edge of its range of those zones, then you know it might get stressed. If it's at the very far north of its northern range, then it's going to be stressed more by, let's see, that'd be actually the heat and things would be kind of stressing that out. If it's at the southern end of its range, if it's at the northern end, then it's probably going to be able to expand further north. So we've got to think about that. You'll see, so I've put the zone designations on the different slides about plants tonight, and you can see that. But you'll probably notice that a lot of these are kind of right in the middle of their zones. Most of our native plants are pretty resilient and have kind of a wide range of the Midwest they take up. But that's something to think about with a lot of your plant selections. What zone is this hardy to? So there's a lot of different arguments for why we should plant natives. Tonight I want to talk a little bit about the ecological perspective. I've already given you kind of the climatic perspective. You know, they're adapted to our climate. They probably have fewer insects and diseases. There's a lot of, cultural reasons we could plant these plants. But from an ecological perspective, native plants are a really important part of biodiversity. So why do we care about biodiversity so much? That's just all the stuff that's out there, all the plants, the animals, the insects, the things that are interacting. We know that our human footprint is ever growing and nature is shrinking. So in our built environments, it's becoming more and more important for us to plant native plants that have an ecological value. I know you guys are all interested in natives. You wouldn't be at a Wild Ones gathering if not, so you know some of these things. But to look at it in more detail, why do we need biodiversity? What's the importance of that? Is it just neat to have all these animals and plants around us? Or is there more of a value? And really this slide kind of talks about it. It's our human life support system here on Earth that this biodiversity is created. I always give the example, I like to look back at the long term, so the geologic time frame or that evolutionary time frame. And if you go back far enough in time, all life on Earth was in the oceans. So it was, it was a lot of microorganisms in the oceans that were respiring that actually created the gases that made our atmosphere and allowed life to then come out of the oceans, expand onto Earth, and evolve all the way to the point where humans now walk around the planet. So it's important. And so today, as we're shrinking that biodiversity, it's not like our atmosphere is going to go away tomorrow, but we're slowly unraveling this. And what we don't understand is all those interconnections that may happen. And I'll talk in a little bit about kind of the food chain or the food web. Everything is very connected. And each year we're understanding more and more of that through research and other things that folks are finding out. about this interconnectedness. So one insect that we eliminate or one plant can have repercussions that we may not necessarily understand. So to look at biodiversity in food webs and how this energy kind of flows and how plants interact with that, all animals really get their energy directly from plants or by eating something that just ate a plant. If you think about it, predators eat an insect that just ate a plant. Plants make up about 80% of that global biomass. So if we look at all the biodiversity on Earth, plants make up about 80% of that. So people like us that are interested in plants, we're looking at that big chunk of Earth's biodiversity. But in all of that, insects play a vital role. And you're going to hear me talk about this quite a bit tonight, the value of these plants to insects. And that's because insects are just a vital transition point between the plant world and the animal world. The plants are fortunate enough to be able to take up all that solar energy that's coming into our environment, that just giant free form of energy the sun provides, and translate that into the animal kingdom by feeding animals or translating that kind of up the food web or the food chain. And so without those insects as kind of the bottom rung of this food web, now food chain was the term that I kind of learned when I was in school. We now describe it as a food web because there are a lot of different interconnections that just go all directions. It's not as simple as a chain that goes link by link. It's a web of interconnectivity. So without insects, we know that food webs collapse. So it's really important to support insect life at the very bottom rung of all of this food web, and plants are one of the most important ways we can do that. And why do we care so much about insects then? Well, we've talked about their importance from an ecological standpoint, but globally we're seeing that they're in decline, and you're probably reading other research about this. This paper from, I think, 2019 was really eye-opening to me, where they talked about, 40% of the insect life on Earth is in decline in one way or another. So that's a pretty big number. And that's important when it's that bottom rung of kind of this food web, and it can, potentially start to unravel it. Now, another eye-opening part about this are the primary drivers of this loss. And look at the things that they've commented on globally from their research that show this decline's happening are all human drivers. So those are all things that we've done to the environment that have created this. So we need to start to work backwards to try and fix some of this things that we removed. Some other key points from the research. Insects comprise about 2/3 of all terrestrial species on Earth. So that's all the land-dwelling animals on Earth. Insects comprise about 2/3 of those. If we go back to the last slide, about 40% of that population is in decline. So that is a pretty stark number when you look at that on a global scale. Insects are declining faster than other biota, faster than birds or plants in a couple different continents. Let's see, there's also agriculture over the past 6 decades has had a big impact. We've seen that probably in central Illinois, and it's not like we see agriculture expanding on a daily basis here. It's kind of where it is for now, but over the past several decades, over the past couple hundred years, we've seen a lot of agricultural expansion that's impacted insect populations. And lastly, pesticide use and widespread pesticide use on the landscape level is another thing that's kind of driving this decline they've found. So those are some of the different aspects. So what's so wrong with non-natives? We've talked about how natives support insects. What's so wrong with non-natives? Well, they're pretty good at removing insects from the environment here when they're taken out of their native ecosystem. That's one of the reasons why we started planting them. That's why not only some of it's our European heritage that we wanted to bring plants across the continent, across the ocean to here to start with. That's historically been done here in the U.S. for a long time, but also those non-native plants that we brought here, they did really well. They didn't have pests on them. They were resistant to a lot of our native insects. And that's because every plant coats its leaves in things to defend itself against either insects that are feeding on it, fungi that are attacking that leaf. Every plant has a complex set of coatings on its leaf that is a result of the evolution that it's experienced with other species. So millions and millions of years of development have created that exact right set of chemicals on its leaves. If insects don't have a coevolutionary relationship with that plant. If they evolved on another continent somewhere else, they don't have any way to interact with those defense mechanisms. So they don't have a way to use that plant. They can't eat the leaves. They can't necessarily use those leaves or twigs or stems for shelter. There's a lot of different ways insects use these plants, and they're just not able to do it if they don't have that coevolutionary relationship. But our native insects, I always give the example of the monarch and the milkweed. I think a lot of us are familiar with that, have overcome some of these barriers. In the case of milkweed, that's a toxin that would kill mammals if we consumed enough of it, where monarch caterpillars are able to eat that, they're able to capitalize on that and incorporate that into their body as a defense mechanism of their own. I love this example from Doug Tallamy's work, and he quotes this in one of his books. I think it was Bringing Nature Home from back in the early 2000s, but he's comparing Kusa dogwood. Is anybody familiar with that? It's a non-native dogwood tree and very ornamentally beautiful. It's a pretty plant. I see why folks have planted it. It has wider pink flowers. But when you compare that to, it supports next to no insect life in the US compared to our native dogwood that supports 117 different species of caterpillars. That's a big difference. So right there we can make a choice of two plants that would fit in the exact same spot in our yard under the exact same growing conditions, same requirements, and we can have this biologically active and valuable plant as opposed to a non-native. And right out of Doug's book, natives support about 29 times more biodiversity than non-natives would. And so I think a lot of you are probably also aware of this, that if we walk out in the average Midwestern landscape, or really in most places in the US, are we going to see a lot of native plants in the landscaping? Nowadays we're starting to see more, but traditionally not, and especially in commercial areas and places where it's a large-scale development happening, it's rare that we see a lot of native plants going in there. So that's kind of building on this problem of why we need to plant native. So we've kind of talked about with dogwood on the last slide, that a relationship of 117 different species, but all of us know that a lot of these insects have a very exclusive relationship with maybe just one plant. So I'll give the example of the zebra swallowtail butterfly. Its caterpillar feeds exclusively on pawpaw leaves. There's not another plant that can support it. So if we don't have the pawpaw, we don't have the zebra swallowtail butterfly. So that's just one example. Lots of these lepidopteran species, so moss and butterflies, have very exclusive relationships, especially in their larval stages, to a single host. But a lot of insects also have very exclusive relationships with the plants they co-evolved with. So this is a question that all of us kind of have to ask ourselves. How native is native for you? I give this example of bald cypress, where at the right here I kind of have there's its range map, which sticks up into Illinois and right along the Ohio, and it covers this area between the Mississippi and the Ohio and southern Illinois, where the remnants of that old river system have left cypress swamps. So that's the one place in Illinois where it can compete out in nature with other plants, are in the Tupelo and cypress swamps of southern Illinois. Now, will it grow here in Normal? Heck yeah, it'll grow here. It'll grow, gosh, I think it goes all the way up to zone 2 or 3. That's pretty far north of here. And does really well. It's one of my favorite urban trees, one of my most highly recommended plants because it's so tough. It's tough as nails. It's used to a flooding environment where soil conditions can change, oxygen moisture can change, or oxygen in the soil can change, and it's adaptable to that. So it can adapt to the urban soils we put it in. It's a really tough plant, but it can't compete out in nature. If we plant it in a forest, it's not gonna have offspring. It's not gonna compete with our native plants. So do you think that the insect life it might support down in far southern Illinois also exists here? And if you plant a cypress tree in your yard, insects will use it. I'm not a good enough entomologist to know all the different species that it uses and be able to answer that question exactly, but I think it's a safe bet to say we probably don't have the same insect populations here that would be present in a Tupelo swamp in southern Illinois. So those are some of the things you would want to think about with this. Now for me, I have bald cypress planted on my property at my house. I enjoy that tree. I've focused other areas of my yard on other native things that I feel like support the biodiversity of Piatt County, the county that I'm in, and I do pay attention to what native species existed in Piatt County, what would be native to my property, and I try to recreate that as much as possible. So you've got to figure out where you draw the line, like how native is native to you? Is that going to be done at the county level? Or are you okay with kind of regional or the state? And so that's a personal decision, but something to think about as you're selecting plants. And I always want to talk about nativars, or warn you about nativars. And have you folks heard this term? It's kind of a buzzword nowadays, but what it means, it's kind of a word we've jammed together from another word we've jammed together. Cultivar is kind of its root word, which really is cultivated variety. And what that's talking about is if you have an individual plant that has a cool characteristic, say you've got a tree that has a really neat color of leaf that's different than the rest of all the other individuals of this species, and you copy that genetically over and over again, you can create a variety of that species. So it's still the same species, but you now have just a slightly different bit of genes that you're expressing there in this cultivated variety of this cultivar. So a nativar is what we create with a native species in that same process, a cultivar of a native species. And so a lot of times you can tell when it's a cultivar because it has the little quotes around a fancy little name after it. I always give the example of Annabelle hydrangea. So Hydrangea arborescens is the species name, and then you've got this little quote, Annabelle, afterwards. You know, I've kind of talked about how traditionally we planted non-natives. Planting natives is catching on. You're starting to see these in garden centers and lots of places, but are you seeing plants that are the straight species? Probably not. In a lot of the larger garden centers where I can find natives in some spot of their in their area, I'm seeing some type of cultivar that's a named variety, and that's just the way the horticulture industry is. Lots of work has been done in the past to develop these different cultivars, and they'll continue to do that for us, but you have to be aware of some of the differences that are happening when this cultivar was created. So it's almost a little bit of extra homework when you decide to go native and you find run into some of these nativars. You've got to do a little bit of extra work to make sure they're still doing your intended purpose. And so I give the example of Annabelle hydrangea because it was developed here in Illinois. This is actually a plant that's on the list this year. Hydrangea arborescens is one of the plants on the list. One of my favorites of all time. I highly recommend this shrub. But Annabelle, you can see in the bottom corner here with these lovely poof ball flowers. Versus there's the flower off our native hydrangeas. So pretty different looking flower structure, right? There's a really neat story that, again, originates in Illinois, that some ladies were horseback riding and noticed this more showy, more ornamentally pretty hydrangea around the turn of the century in the early 1900s, and took it home and cultivated it and developed it, spread it locally, and eventually a professor at U of I found it, and this variety, Annabelle, came out of U of I. It's actually probably one of the most popular hydrangeas in the US. Now it's got a lot of spin-offs. There's Invincible and Incredible and all these other hydrangeas that are similar that have been improved on a little bit from Annabelle. But what happened here is we bred for a more ornamentally beautiful flower compared to this, and what actually we selected for was these sterile lace cap flowers. That's what you would probably refer to as a lace cap flower. These flowers have no pollinator value, so this has very little pollinator value. It's all in this center part right here where the pollen and nectar is available to insects, and that's why I have this picture of a really huge. This is one from the Shawnee National Forest that just has a really great. I go back and visit this plant almost every spring. It's close to a place I go down there a lot. And it just has some of the biggest of the flower development that I've seen on a hydrangea arborescens. But we inadvertently selected for a more beautiful plant to us that it has less insect value. And that was actually, the actual value of this was explored in this 2019 paper that you'll see. Well, actually, I guess he's not listed here, but I was going to say Doug Tallamy was involved in this research. I don't know if you guys can't tell, I'm a Doug Tallamy fan. He's put out a lot of great research and books that bring that together. But this was a really interesting study that compared 6 native shrub species and their cultivars. So they picked 6 species and 2 to 3 different cultivars of each one of those and compared insect use. I mean, they went up and down the plants. Pollinator visits, leaf insects that feed on leaves and stems and everything. Check out this paper if you want to hear all the details. I was going to summarize just what they found off of Annabelle hydrangea, but if you're interested in this whole topic, I did a presentation a couple years ago where I compared native versus nativars and all the research to date. This is probably 3 or 4 years ago now. So this is one of the papers I reviewed there, and it's recorded online at go.illinois.edu/nativars, where I went through all the research that was out there at the time and kind of summarized it all. And I guess my finding in that was that really similar findings in this paper overall. Their conclusion was that it really depends on how the plant was altered. In the case of Annabelle hydrangea, we know we've taken away some of those fertile flowers, those flowers that have value, but in other cases there was nativars that actually had more pollinator interest because those changes helped insects. So you've got to think of what's going on with the plant. If it's major changes, if the flower structure has been changed, good bet that pollinators don't use it the same. Another big finding they had, they compared some purple leaf varieties of 9-bark, which is on our list. Pretty sure 9-bark's on the list this year. That's a native shrub. And there's purple leaf varieties of that. Well, when you change a leaf purple, that really changes the way an insect might view that leaf or use it. So those big changes in color, in form of the flower, those are the things that I can't say that every time you change the leaf color, that changes insect use in a negative way. But those are the things that the research has kind of showed us. Those major changes in the ways that insects might view that plant are the ways that you can make it less valuable as a nativar. So what did the paper find with native hydrangea? I guess in this case I call it wild hydrangea. That's what the paper had been calling it, versus Annabelle hydrangea down here. Well, Annabelle hydrangea had a 28-day flower duration, so a longer duration of flowers, and it started a little bit earlier. So that goes right in line with something we'd want out of an ornamental plant, right? Earlier flowering, longer bloom time. But the big numbers lie in the fertile flowers, where 99% on our native hydrangea are fertile flowers, and only about 42% are fertile flowers in this. On Annabelle hydrangea, and the reason we can't even see those inside there. So take a look at a hydrangea the next time you're looking at one of these big mophead hydrangeas, and you can look inside and see some of those tiny flowers that have some insect value, but you don't see a lot of insects on there. And one of the things the paper noted is that it may have been influenced, insect use may have been influenced by the fact that the valuable part of the flower is hidden inside there. It's just not as easy for insects to get in and use it. So anyway, that's the stats on one example here, and there's a lot of others that you can look at, but do your homework before you take home a nativar. Everything in this plant sale is the straight species, so it's not a nativar, it's the species you're getting. It hasn't been bred for any of these special characteristics. So now let's get to some of the species lists I like to talk about. I'm a little heavy on the shrubs in this case, but I also have some trees, but I've kind of organized each list of species, the slides, with some of these characteristics. And you'll see it kind of at the top of the slide. I talk about kind of the light requirements, the soil moisture conditions, and then at the top of the slide, it'll kind of say that, and I'll show you on this first example. And then I have just kind of a plethora of other information in there I'll kind of discuss, but I'm kind of going from full sun to shade with the shrubs. So smaller plants at the start of the slides to larger plants at the end is kind of the general flow of things. But so you can see New Jersey tea is what we'll talk about first. And it's going to require full sun to part shade. I really tend to plant this more in a full sun type setting. So I'm kind of starting with some of the plants that are a little more full sun. And this is a smaller shrub. It doesn't get very tall. It's got pretty white flowers and blooms for, gosh, about a month in the early springtime. So as far as ornamental attributes, it actually offers a lot in the flowering department, but on each of my slides, I've kind of tried to break down this wildlife value, where in this case, it provides both nectar and pollen. So some flowers don't have as much nectar or don't have as much pollen. In this case, it's got a lot of nectar and a lot of pollen. One of the things I've tried to research and I've never got there on is trying to put a value for nectar per flower or nectar production per plant, or some kind of number like that we could put in a plant that would maybe indicate it's a bigger producer than another, because I think there's some inequalities there. But anyway, I'll try and point that out on, what's the value of some of these flowers, but nectar and pollens for bees, wasps, flies, beetles, and butterflies. So that's a lot of different pollinators groups it's supporting. I don't have a slide of this, but there's a really interesting table we refer to as pollinator syndromes is kind of the concept here, but it's got flower traits down one side and insects down the other, and we know that these relationships exist from research. So certain shapes and colors of flowers work for certain types of pollinators. And in this case, New Jersey tease flower works for a lot of different pollinator groups. So you'll actually attract a lot of pollinators to this plant. There's also some insects that use the leaves for feeding, for stem boring. So getting inside that stem, and either bees that lay their eggs or insects that use it for shelter. And some insects even use the seeds as well. So as we go through these slides, I'll try and kind of characterize the ecological value there. I would say a high ecological and horticultural value, the horticultural value being that ornamental display that it gives. And it's really a smaller shrub that has a really nice blooming characteristic. And there's not a lot of those. Like, a lot of shrubs don't stay as short as this little guy. Where I've really found it to work well is kind of on the edge or corner of the bed. One of the spots that I like this the most in my landscaping is I put it next to aromatic aster. Does anybody know that native plant? Is that a nice guy or a bad guy in the garden a lot of times? Anybody know the answer to that? It can be kind of aggressive, can't it? So I've got this little New Jersey tea that's in the corner there, kind of holding its own, next to that really aggressive aromatic aster. So it can handle a situation like that. I like how it's just a kind of nicely rounded shrub. It's about as wide as it is tall. And so it creates kind of a smooth transition to that rough, looking, more coarse looking aster that's next to it. So that's one of the spots I like it the most as a specimen, kind of on the corner edge of the bed from the ornamental standpoint, or as a grouping or a planting of 3 to 5 is how I'm usually using that in my landscaping. Now, this is another concept for pollinator benefit that you can think about, is grouping plants together. So blocks of species is a common recommendation for pollinators. And why is that? That's because every flight that pollinator takes to the next flower is energy it's consuming, and if it doesn't have enough nectar coming in, it's going to run out of energy or get stressed. So if you can plant that one thing that's blooming all together in your garden, then these insects don't have to go as far to travel to every single one. So as opposed to planting one New Jersey tea on the corner of every bed in my garden, I'm trying to put them in a central spot or have them in groupings. I'm trying to think of some of the other things to note. I've listed problems on these slides. I don't think that's necessarily means that powdery mildew is even a problem. I've never had really powdery mildew be a problem on my New Jersey tea. I'm just trying to note anything that comes up as a potential problem. But if you look at the things that it's tolerant of, drought, erosion, and dry conditions, those are some pretty good tolerances, right? So the one place that this plant probably can't go is where you have poor drainage. That's going to be its one weakness. It really likes a dry soil, a dry site. And really its ornamental value, again, is kind of in its flowering display and the shape and size that it has. Next on our list is another smaller shrub, shrubby St. John's wort. And if you haven't seen this plant in bloom, it is just kind of a spectacular little canopy, just covered in these really pretty little yellow flowers. And those are pretty tiny flowers. It gets a little taller and stays a little bit skinnier than New Jersey tea is how I usually explain it. Where New Jersey tea is kind of the smaller rounded shrub, it's a little more upright and gets a little bit taller. I tend to use it further back in a bed in my plantings because it again gets a little bit taller. It really works well as a grouping. I rarely am putting this plant by itself. I usually have it grouped with others. Now, note on this plant, we don't have any nectar available, so it's only going to be pollen-seeking insects. So that's a lot of our bees and flies are going to be after this. But it also produces quite a few other types of insect, or supports quite a few other types of insects. But mammals don't feed on the leaves, so that's maybe a downside in the wildlife value department. But that's maybe a good thing if you have deer present, because so another way to say that is it's deer resistant. But this has a high pollinator value just due to the fact that it has a long bloom period. It really blooms. It's another one that blooms for just about 3 weeks to almost a month sometimes, depending on the individual plant and the season. So I say it has a high pollinator value because it has such a long season of bloom. But another great kind of smaller shrub for the urban landscape, and really next to no problems that I've encountered. Okay, next is 9-bark, and we've talked about this one a little bit. This is a little bit taller of a shrub, and I think probably 8 feet. I've seen taller 9-barks than 8 feet, so it kind of depends on the site. If you have a really good soil, maybe they'll get a little bit taller, but where I'm going to 9-bark in a landscape setting is when it's a really tough spot. It's another plant that doesn't really like wet conditions as much, but gosh, if you have a really gravelly, crummy soil, this is going to be the shrub that's going to do well there. It's just a really tough, great performer in kind of those not ideal sites. And so what's its ornamental value or its pollinator value? Probably its flowering. So it has nectar and pollen for pollinators. And it flowers in the early spring, May to June. Probably doesn't quite get a 3 to 4 week bloom period, but about a couple weeks of nice white flowers in the springtime is what you'll get from nine bark. So it's a great taller shrub, again, for kind of problem spots, or I like it as a hedge or a row or as a grouping. I think it works really well together like that. Hazelnut is the next one on our list, which actually probably a lot of you know has an edible nut. So that's one of its greatest attributes. Is probably its fruit. That's probably what it's known the most for, but it actually has an interesting flower that I have pictured here. So neat, attractive looking flower, not quite as long of a bloom period, but still we do get some pollinator benefit out of that. So let's see, about 14 species of moths are supported by it. Mammals and birds eat the nuts, and there's a lot of different mammals and birds that eat the nuts. I couldn't actually get a succinct list out of different sources for that, but there's quite a few things that we use it. One of the things I do want to point out, though, as we get into some more of these shrubs, is that some of these are thicket forming, and that can be good or bad. And if you know what I mean by that, that means they're going to spread by the roots and start to grow and expand their area. So that can be good in certain places where you want a giant visual block from a hazelnut. That can be bad when you're trying to plant it as a specimen right in the middle of your front yard and have that be the only plant. So I'll note that on these slides. This is kind of the first thicket forming shrub we ran across. And that doesn't mean they aren't manageable. I've got these plants at my house and I keep them in the spot they're at. You just have to be aware that if you plant it into a mulch bed, especially where you've got just this prime rooting environment, it's gonna try and send up sprouts. You're gonna have to manage those a little bit over time. But this is definitely, we're getting a little taller. As you know, I said we'll go up in size, so it's a taller shrub. It fits a bigger space. It does have pretty decent fall color at times, so there's that ornamental value that it gives. Sometimes you get pretty good fall color out of these with varying shades from red to purple, kind of in that range. So it's tolerant of clay soils and kind of some of our more poorly drained soils. So notice the soil rating here is medium. It probably doesn't like standing water and wet feet, but can handle a little bit more clay or a little bit poorer soil in that respect. Next is buttonbush, and this is another plant, like I talked about bald cypress earlier. This is another plant from the Tupelo swamps of southern Illinois. So it grows in almost a monotype in certain areas down there, but handles standing water almost year round. The Cache River area is probably the place I think of this the most, but so it does take a little bit of a special condition in your yard. This is one that I've had. I love its flower. I mean, look at that really cool flower. You don't see a lot of other flowers like that are kind of that spiky ball. And when it blooms, this is definitely one that you just notice the buzz around. Pollinators really like that flower structure, and it has a decently long bloom period, but not quite 3 or 4 weeks, maybe just a couple weeks in June or July. But I have had some issues with this plant in my yard because I'm not really watering things. This is one that probably needs a little bit wetter of a spot for sure. I planted it close to, not a shagbark hickory, a shellbark hickory in our yard. And that's kind of the wet corner of our front yard. And shellbark hickory, if you're familiar with that tree, is kind of it's very similar to shagbark, except it grows in a wetter environment. There's kind of poor drainage with the ditch there, and I just felt like, based on the other plants I could see and weeds growing there, it was a wet enough spot for the buttonbush, and that plant is still hanging on, but it just does not look good, and I've started to have to water it. So that's maybe my one heads up with buttonbush is pick the right site. If you had somewhere where there was like a pond or a stream bank, that's a great spot where it can get its roots into something wet. Or if you just have a place where you have other like water-loving plants that you're providing a little bit more water for, that's kind of one of the aspects of buttonbush. But as a selling point, nothing beats a buttonbush when it's in bloom with those flowers. It also offers really excellent fall color, and those buttons turn red in the fall and are pretty neat, attractive things in the fall and into the winter. So it's got some positive things if you have the right site for it, but I always want to kind of inform folks that it's good for a wet site, it's bad for a drier site. Next is Eastern Wahoo. What a fun name. Have you guys anybody heard of this plant before? Eastern Wahoo. But this is one that definitely has excellent fall color. That's probably one of the main selling points for this plant. Gets a little bit taller, but it definitely takes some shade. I say full sun to part shade. It could probably almost handle about full shade based on where I've seen it growing in the forest. Now, in a full shade type environment, it's not going to be as full of a shrub as you might imagine. You know, it thins out a little bit, it gets a little taller and skinnier when it's in the shade, where in the sun, just like a lot of other plants, it's a little bushier and not quite as tall and spread out. But from the ornamental side, it's got some interesting cool flowers in June, so it'll have like a nice display of flowers that then produce these fruits that are actually really interesting looking drupes on the shrub and are ornamental throughout most of the growing season. Probably one of the best things that it offers is that excellent fall color. So notice it's a euonymus species. The other euonymus species that I always throw a slide in is burning bush, which is a non-native and an invasive. So this was probably one of the plants that was the most heartbreaking for me to learn as an invasive and a non-native and things. Like when I first came out of college, my first job was in tree care in the urban environment, and I definitely didn't see native and non-native as black and white as I do now. Really, if a plant grew well, that was something that I would recommend to my clients, and we planted a lot of. And so, gosh, I love burning bush for a lot of reasons. It grew well, but it was also really prunable. You can prune a burning bush to almost any shape. It just really did not have a lot of problems in the landscape other than getting loose. And so it's been tough for me to go down this road of saying, gotta get rid of burning bush, but I've seen it in enough places now. My neighborhood in Piatt County, the only thing that's worse than this is bush honeysuckle. So it's really convinced me over the years it's a bad one. We got to stop. And I can tell you, in most of the spots where I'm finding it, it's close to places where it's in yards. It's not like honeysuckle where it's just everywhere. We really can start to limit this by getting it out of the landscape. So tell your friends and neighbors they need to switch this euonymus species for this one. And the only thing that I would say Wahoo maybe doesn't do as well as burning bush is grow in the shade, where burning bush will take a decent amount of shade and stay pretty bushy and full. Wahoo is going to not have that as well. But it does get a little bit taller, it's a little bit bigger, and offers at least nectar for small bees and flies, or its big attraction. Also, there's bird species that eat the berries that we see here. So there's some different animals that it supports. I wouldn't say it's kind of the high value pollinator plant that some of the others that bloom profusely are. So also I note here, sometimes it's hard to find in nurseries, but you all have a great location to get that here. So next, let's move on to one of my favorites for the shade, and this is spice bush. And you can see its flower here is in the very early spring. This is one of the first things to bloom, and so I've really enjoyed this as a forester out in the woods in the springtime. This is like the first thing you start to see blooming. It has all those flowers develop into bright red little berries that are actually kind of showy once the leaves come on. Its leaves have like a spice, it's called spice bush because its leaves have kind of a pleasant scent. The one thing to know about spice bush though is that it's a dioecious plant. And if you're not familiar with that term, that means there's male and female plants. So I definitely recommend you plant a grouping with the hope that you get a female out of that will flower. But even if you don't, this is one of the few shrubs that I can recommend for almost full 100% shade. That's where it grows in a forest ecosystem, is under the canopy. It competes with things like bush honeysuckle in the understory, probably not quite as well as it should. Honeysuckle usually outcompetes it, but it's a competitor in the understory, so it can handle the shade garden in an urban environment. There's not a lot of shrubs that can be planted right along ferns and hostas and all the other things we kind of add to a shade garden. So that's probably its benefit. It's probably my favorite shrub for a shaded environment. next to the Annabelle hydrangea, or hydrangea arborescens, not Annabelle. And so that's in the sale too. I feel like I've talked about hydrangea enough. I didn't put in a slide about it, but that's probably the other shrub that I would recommend for a completely shaded situation is hydrangea. It does really well in that 100% shade. Let's see. So now let's move on to the tree species list. And I've only got a few off of this list, but wanted to cover serviceberry, which people have argued with me that is maybe a shrub. Call it a tree, call it a shrub. It's somewhere in between. It gets to be about 15 by 20 feet tall. It actually kind of spreads out. And a lot of times you see this plant as a multi-stem, multi-trunked plant like you see in this picture. You can actually train it to be a single stem plant if that's what you desire, or you can have it multi-stem. In my house, I've always grown it as a clump because that's how I usually see it in nature. It really takes kind of some human intervention to get that one stem to grow, or a shaded environment where it's limited by shade in nature. So this is just one of my favorite 4-season plants, and I've kind of got all 4 seasons on this slide. It's got beautiful flowers in the springtime. They develop into edible fruits that we can eat. You've got to get it before the birds do. If you want to eat these, though, they just, on my plants, they usually just get eaten away. And then in the fall time, that beautiful reddish color. And then in the wintertime, I think its smooth bark is really attractive. And that's why I like the multi-stemmed habit that I just let happen on mine, because then you have a lot of that trunk to show in the wintertime. So if you're looking for kind of a medium-sized to small-sized tree, this is just a great solution. Offers all those things, has both nectar and pollen for pollinators, and I've listed kind of some of the other things supports. We found evidence of about 32 different bird species that are native that eat the fruits, and about 6 different mammal species also eat it. Deer will browse it, so that's something to be aware of, although it can definitely get up above deer browse if it needs to. Now, one thing I do warn folks of, in this sale, you know, if you buy it from this plant sale, you'll be getting the straight species, but Autumn Brilliance is a nativar of this plant that I have been interacting with for all my decades of tree experience since the late 90s. I've been planting this plant and dealing with it. I even have one planted at my house, but it's a cultivar that I just don't think performs well anymore. And it's not necessarily in its younger years that it does bad, but it reaches a certain point, and this isn't always. I can show you plenty of examples like this picture here of mature, healthy Autumn Brilliance service berries, but I've come across in the last decade or so a lot of different cases of this plant that I can't tell you what it died of or why it started to decline. There's not a disease or an insect present. It's just environmental conditions. You know, and that's like the worst thing to tell a homeowner. You know, what's the problem with your shrub? Well, something in the environment, you know, drought or something has killed it. What happens a lot of times in the urban environment is, again, I'm hammering the soils for you guys because that's really one of the big changes is what's going on in that rooting environment. We know from research that a tree that's just grown in an unobstructed soil is going to have a root spread that's about 3 to 5 times the drip line of its canopy. At a certain point, these plants that are planted into urban spaces that don't have a lot of rooting space, that canopy keeps growing and just kind of outgrows the rooting space they can develop or the root system they can get going to develop that canopy further. And I think that's the case with some of these Autumn Brilliance examples I've seen is it just got to a point where there's a sidewalk, a driveway, something else blocking it. It just doesn't have any more space to expand its root system to keep supporting that canopy that's growing. But there's other cases where I can't tell you what it is. We've tested soil, we've looked at any type of pathogen or disease that we could test for on these plants. And so, I don't know, I guess it just shows, it goes back to the thing I'm kind of trying to hammer home tonight too, is plant something native, a straight species of something native. And so anyway, serviceberry, one of my favorites of all time and just a great kind of medium-sized tree. Redbud is another great one for its spring flowering. It's a little bit larger. It probably gets a little bit taller than serviceberry, and it can be kind of multi-stem, usually kind of a singular stem on this plant, but has this really beautiful kind of almost 4-week bloom period of these like bright pink flowers that just kind of cover the stems up and down, and that's what I think makes it so beautiful. There's flower buds all up and down the stems as opposed to just out of the tips with some things that we see. Offers nectar and pollen for bees, a few species of caterpillars, some leafhoppers, some wood-boring beetles, birds eat the seeds. So it actually has a pretty high wildlife value, and when I think of one of the just main understory trees in Illinois, probably dogwood and redbud are the main ones I think of. So it's around a lot. It's kind of what I feel like symbolizes a small tree for Illinois. But I don't know on the problems. As it gets older, it does develop cankers on the stem, or you've probably seen this, where the stems start to kind of get some rot in there and kind of fall apart. That's maybe a problem way down the road for these. It's not something that would restrict me from planting it, but it's something to think about that I kind of listed here. The other problem is seedlings that I list here, and that is a real thing. I have got just a ring of red buds around my property, and one of the main weeds in my landscape beds are red buds, you know, and so it's not that big of a deal. If you pull them when they're small, they just come right out. But the dilemma is then, do I plant this or not? And my wife and I go through this all the time. We're pulling out these little red buds, and it's like, man, I should plant you somewhere, little red bud. There's a point in time where you just got to say, we've got enough red buds. And it also, if you do try to do this, I can tell you, the smaller you get those seedlings, the better. And we've tested all different sizes. Take them in February and take the little tiny ones. So then what that leads us to do is think, oh, we're going to move some of those red buds over there. Let's not weed those. We'll get them in February. And what happens by the next spring? We haven't moved them and they've got too many roots on them. So lesson learned on the seedlings. It's not a bad problem to have, red buds as weeds, but there's definitely a way you can manage that to your advantage, and just understand you're not going to be able to plant every seedling, and you just need to pull them. Okay, so I want to get into a couple of the oak species on here. And the first thing I want to point out, and this is probably something a lot of you are aware of, but man, is there a wildlife value to these plants. And that's kind of, if you read Doug Tallamy's work, he gets to this point as well. There is just hundreds of insect species that oaks support, as well as mammals, birds. We know that the oak ecosystem, there's different forest cover types in Illinois. Oak hickory is one of them. Beech maple is one of them. We know that oak hickory is the most diverse forested ecosystem we can manage for as that dominant plant species in the forest. And that's because they support so many other insects, so many other mammals, birds, other plants exist in that ecosystem. They're just the best of the best. So if you're going to plant a shade tree for ecological value, plant one of our oaks. There's differences between some of them from an ornamental standpoint or a little bit of their wildlife value, but in general I can say, like, when somebody asks me what's the best, most ecologically significant tree I can plant, I'm going to recommend one of the oaks to you. In this case we're talking about northern oak, or northern red oak, and one of the cool things it's got is pretty good fall color. Out of our native oaks, it's known to be one of the best for fall color. It also, I would say, also has interesting bark as it gets older and matures a bit. And this has been described by a lot of folks. I do a lot of tree ID hikes, and I describe this to folks as ski tracks in the snow. If you've ever seen like a cross-country ski course where there's tracks crossing everywhere. And so I think that's actually a pretty attractive trunk as it gets bigger and larger. On the downside, it's going to be a slow grower. You know, oaks are relatively slow growing, but out of the oak group, red oak is probably one of the faster growing oaks. So it's a little faster than really slow like some of the others, but very tolerant of drought, tolerant of our varying soils. It's pretty adaptable amongst the oaks. It's not a finicky one. And so it's going to be, again, a large shade tree at maturity, so it's going to be a big tree. One of the things to think about for the long term with this plant is what type of rooting zone am I planting it into? Is it going to have, and I think there's few times in the urban environment we're going to get 3 to 5 times the spread of the branches, but it's not a plant to put in that little courtyard that is confined by concrete. Has anybody been to U of I campus and visited the Red Oak Rain Garden? It's a really neat spot on campus. It's free and open to the public to go to. I wouldn't say it's 100% native. They have some tulips and things that are orange and blue. They've got a few like little tiny bits of non-native stuff, but only for like true Illinois spirit type things like that. But go check it out sometime if you're on campus. You can just walk through and look at it, but tons of native plants in this garden. We actually did, before they were doing some construction, a study of the root zone of their oak because we wanted to try and avoid where the roots are. And so I came in and helped them do that with a tool called an air spade. I don't know if anybody's heard of this, but it's a big compressed air tool that you just turn on the air and it blows away all the soil. It's like magic. So what you can do with it is excavate around roots and it doesn't damage the roots. So what I did was went around under their oak tree and just blew holes and tried to measure where the roots were so we could avoid it with construction. It was just a really interesting study of some of the concepts that you hear about and read about in the literature, where, you know, as you approach a sidewalk or one of these concrete structures, roots don't go under it. And, you know, I think we all have seen a sidewalk that's been pushed up by roots, right? There's lots of thinking, we can't see what's down there without digging, so you'd think maybe that's not true. Roots surely have to get past this. But that red oak, the sidewalks are spread out, but it's confined by sidewalks, and I could show you from my data points, the closer you get to the compaction of that soil at the sidewalk, the fewer roots we got to where there was just within 4 or 5 feet of that sidewalk next to no roots. So that was really kind of an eye-opening experience kind of studying that, but it also made me think about, gosh, when we plant these trees, you know, someday this plant doesn't get roots any bigger than this, essentially this basin we've planted it in. So it's something to think about for the long term. So again, red oak, it would be one that you plant for great fall color. I list a couple problems here of oak wilt and bacterial leaf scorch. And those are two serious problems of red oaks. Oak wilt is spread by a beetle, and there's really, you know, the best thing we can do to not get for our tree to not get oak wilt is to not attract that beetle. And so the best recommendation there is to only prune your oak trees in the wintertime. If you prune them during the summertime, they'll release a scent that draws that beetle in. So prune your oaks in the wintertime and keep a healthy, keep your tree healthy, and you hopefully won't have problems with oak wilt. If that beetle shows up in your neighborhood, it's probably coming to a not healthy tree first, and then it's spreading outward. So that's another reason to be vigilant, be on the lookout. Watch for oaks that are, you start to see the canopy rapidly dying on. That can be a sign of oak wilt. That beetle actually introduced a fungus that clogs the vascular tissue or the veins and arteries of the tree and just slowly cuts off the canopy. But it usually happens over a summer or two. So that's something to be aware of. And when it gets in the neighborhood, folks start to realize. So be aware of oak wilt. It's not a reason not to plant this. Keep your red oak healthier than the one next to it. And the same can be said for bacterial leaf scorch. It's also another fatal disease of oak trees, but it's going to prey on an oak tree that's already stressed from something else. I've rarely seen that happen on an oak that was in perfect health. There's usually other stresses there in that case. So a couple of disease problems to think about, but when you look at the wildlife value and how many red oaks there are around the community, I don't think it's something to necessarily convince you not to plant it, but just something to be aware of and think about. So next, let's go to chinkapin oak, another one in the sale, and a little bit slower of a grower than red oak, but I would say it's probably still at the faster end of all the oaks. So it's probably one of our more faster and probably definitely one of the most tolerant oaks and adaptable. And notice I list alkaline soils there. What's that mean? That means soils that are not acidic. And that's another condition in the urban environment that we see a lot are alkaline soils. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them can be concrete and other materials that have been mixed in. All those calcareous materials, calcium makes the soil more alkaline. So a lot of times it's past remnants of other things that have happened there that are making that soil more alkaline. A lot of times it's our well water that we're using. And where I'm not sure where the municipal water in Bloomington comes from. In Champaign, that's coming out of the ground. At my house, it's coming out of a well on my property. And all that groundwater that we pump out is very basic. So when I'm watering my plants, I'm driving that soil alkalinity. Last year, we did a big soil sampling of one of the Master Gardener gardens in Champaign, and I was shocked to see how high the pH was just across the board. I mean, in every spot, even in our blueberry patch, we had fairly high soil pH where we've been acidifying. So it's a big problem across central Illinois. I think it's one of the problems that's tied to some of those autumn brilliant service berries having issues. I can show you a few where we did have alkaline soils in the mix in those cases. So, and we know that it's just, you know, there's not like a black and white line where a tree cannot grow past this pH. It's kind of a gray area, but it affects nutrient uptake and affects a lot of different things going on in the plant. So this is one of the oaks that is very alkaline tolerant. I've seen it growing in southern Illinois in limestone geology. That's about as alkaline as you can get, and it does really well there. It's also another oak that reliably would produce offspring out in the wild. And that was one of as my job as a forester, I was usually looking out for the canopy above, but also the understory and what's in that understory. Most of the time as a forester, I was managing the understory for the next forest to make sure we've got new trees coming in. Chinkapin oak is one that was very robust in the understory compared to others that would be more difficult to get. And so that doesn't mean that you're gonna have a bunch of seedlings like a redbud in your yard. It just means it's very adaptable. It can grow in a wide range of situations. So if you're looking for a tough oak, this is probably our tougher one on the list. Lastly, I just want to talk real quick about proper tree planting, and I hope this isn't a lecture you guys have had too many times, but I think the biggest thing to pay attention to is the depth you're planting the tree at. And if you haven't heard this before, the root flare of the tree, so where that trunk flares out, is an important thing to pay attention to and keep above the soil line. And a lot of times when you get especially a balled and burlap plant or a bigger root ball, that root flare can be down in the ball quite a ways. I'm guessing that this plant material is probably 3 to 5 gallon pots. Or is that true? Yeah, smaller potted plants. That's kind of my favorite planting material because they're less stressed than some of those bigger things that are balled and burlapped. And I would say after about 10 years, they probably catch up to each other. You know, they probably doesn't make as much of a difference long term. But even in those pots, it's important to try and find that first root coming out of the trunk and get that at the right depth. The most common mistake is digging the hole too deep. So before you even dig your hole, figure out how deep that root flare is in your pot, and you may only be digging a hole about this deep. People are shocked at how shallow the hole is I dig, but when the tree's planted and done, you can see that root flare right at the surface. You may have to peel a little bit off the top of the root ball if it's down in it a little bit, but get that at the right surface because that sets the tree up for the future. Don't worry about digging a deep hole. That's a lot of work. Dig a wide hole. And really the reason why we want that hole so wide is so those roots can get out and start to equal the canopy width. You know, think about that potted plant and that 3 to 5 times the canopy spread kind of number. I know it's a young tree. We're talking about a mature tree with this full spread, but it really doesn't have much compared to the spread of its canopy or the canopy is trying to support. So the biggest thing for that newly planted tree is to get its roots out of the planting hole and out into the surrounding landscape so it can get as large of a root system and gather as much moisture and nutrients as it can. So think about all those things when you're planting your trees from the sale. And with that, I think we probably have time for a few questions if folks want to ask a question about any of the plants or any of the others on the plant list. Yeah.
Yeah, redbuds, one thing I've noticed with mine, the lower branches often die. Is that common?
So I'm just going to repeat the question for folks at home. I think we have a mic coming around, but the question was on redbuds. She often has a lot of lower dead branches, and is that common? And yes, that is. A lot of times a tree will let a branch die that's shaded because it's not getting enough energy out of the leaves that are in there. Because they're shaded, they're not getting enough light to produce enough energy. So yeah, on redbuds that's common. What are some of the worst? Honey locust. If anybody's ever looked up at a honey locust and seen a lot of dead limbs, it's one of the worst. Pin oak probably is another one that's bad. So there's certain trees that are just, if I see inner dead limbs on a pin oak, I don't worry about it. But when you start to see dead tips up at the top of the canopy and on the ends of branches, that's a different pattern of dead, and that's something bad. But no, inner dead limbs on a redbud is pretty common and not something I worry about too much. Good question. Yes, I guess, I don't know who raised their hand first, but.
My surface berry is already, leaves are already turning yellow. Is that a sign that it's a problem?
So the question was, her service berries leaves are already turning yellow. Is that a sign of a problem? And yeah, that's a sign of stress. Early fall color is usually a sign of some type of other stress going on for the plant. And I don't know, I mean, there's a laundry list of things you could kind of check out. I mean, the biggest thing I'm probably looking at is like, what is the root situation? Was it planted at the right depth? Does it service berry? And you could say this for a lot of species, have a tendency to have girdling root problems when they're planted too deep. So I'd be kind of looking around for that. Not saying you'll necessarily find a girdling root, but just check out that trunk flare area, see if you see anything wrong with that. Best thing you can probably do if you're not seeing an obvious problem, if you don't have some symptoms on leaves that we could start to look at, is just, I mean, the basics of keeping it watered when it's really hot like this, and just kind of helping it nurse it through. Yeah, the real like adding mulch and watering. But if you do have a lot of, my contact info is up here, and I'm happy to answer plant questions. If you all have some later, feel free to reach out, but or send pictures. I can always help with some pictures. But yeah, another question?
Yeah, so I have a fairly small yard that unfortunately is very dominated by a large pine tree. And I know. Thank you. Growing anything in the vicinity of pine trees can be challenging. Do you have any shrub recommendations that could be not under but adjacent to that tree that, you know, would be resilient to that?
Well, if you did want some, well, I gave two examples of pretty good shade species. And I think both of those would do well in conjunction with the pine. So spicebush and hydrangea, I think both would do well close by. But if you're going to be under the blackout shade of that pine tree, probably spicebush is the only thing I would put there. Hydrangea might grow, but it's going to be really thin and not have a lot of flowers. So kind of bringing it out to the edge. Another thing that you could think about is pruning a little bit and bringing back some of those limbs. I'm surprised sometimes on a pine tree with just maybe one key limb that blocks the kind of southern aspect, how you could get a little more light under there. But yeah, those would be my two big recommendations. And you know, I think you're kind of alluding towards the fact that pines like acidity or create acidity. You'd be surprised if you tested the soil under your pine tree. It's not a pine forest that's been there for hundreds of years. It's one pine tree. It probably doesn't have all that much acidity added. And just like we talked about with alkalinity, a lot of these plants like things more alkaline than what we're planting them in. So really, I think the reason why you would pick something is based on the light coming in as opposed to proximity to the pine tree. So
I noticed that you mentioned amending the soil when planting a tree. Can you say more about that?
Amending the soil, I don't usually recommend unless you're digging up just a jumbled up mix of stuff. So did my slide say like add amended soil or something? I guess I couldn't see the bottom points of my slide. And for the most part, trees don't need, they aren't high nutrient demand plants like say a tomato plant. That plant needs high soil fertility. Really to get a good tomato crop, we're almost needing to add fertility, you know, throughout the growing season. Trees don't need a high nutrient content. They're more sensitive to that soil structure, and that's what I've been kind of hammering home tonight. They're more sensitive to compacted soil, to jumbled up, mixed up clay that maybe was dug up from a foundation and put in your yard, and that's what you're digging into. So really, I usually recommend as you're digging the hole for your tree, it's kind of a guess at times, but try and figure out if that's a decent undisturbed soil. Does it seem like it's like an undisturbed soil would have soil horizons going down where the color changes and gradual here in central Illinois? Or does it seem like it's all mixed up and there's chunks of things in there? And in the case where I find a really mixed up soil, yeah, I'm probably going to replace it with backfill, at least in that planting hole that I'm backfilling. And so what do I mean by good soil, or what are you going to replace it with? If you take that bad soil and mix in about a third of finished compost, you create a pretty good soil for the most part. You can also buy like garden soil products at landscape recycling centers. That's what I've used to use in the past. The Urbana has a really nice landscape recycling center that sells a soil product, but it's the same thing. It's about a third compost, 2/3 mineral soil that they're mixing up. I tend to shy away from the bagged soil products that you can buy at garden centers. There's sometimes weird things in what they're calling garden soil and some of those bagged products, but so I usually am just looking at if that soil I take out is really crummy, just kind of adding back in some organic matter and mixing it up real good so it's nice and loose and has like a loose structure as you put it back in. So, but good question, yeah.
Anybody else?
What about adding biochar or just charcoal?
The question was, what about adding biochar? Well, there's lots of research on biochar and information about it these days. I have never actually added it to a tree, so I don't know from personal experience, but I don't think it hurts anything. But like I was kind of mentioning, anything we can do to kind of improve or preserve that soil structure, so the arrangement of the particles, is good. And adding organic matter is helping that structure. It's helping add some sponginess that absorbs minerals. It's also helping fuel the natural nutrient cycle that's going on in the soil. And that's kind of what biochar does. It adds to that structure and it kind of fuels that microbial population. So, so yeah, I don't know that it's, I'm not sure what it would do for a tree, but I know it's not bad. Any other questions?
I noticed one of your good points was jug loam, and I live on an oak savanna, and oak isn't the only tree growing out there. So I'm surprised anything grows where there's black walnuts.
Yeah, you know, I think there's been kind of some more current research that's looking at we're maybe trying to play down the jug loam thing anymore nowadays. That it's not as big of a deal. Like some of the research that they looked at that in the 70s was in a lab in a greenhouse with, you know, kind of an isolated situation where you're exposing something to jug loam. Where we think that some of the thinking nowadays is out in nature. There's a lot more things in that soil environment that are interacting, so it's less of a problem. But I'm kind of trying to put that on these slides as a selling point, you know. But for the most part, most of our native plants are going to be jug loam tolerant, so it's kind of not an awesome point. But I don't know. Most of our native stuff should do okay.
Anybody else? I do want to say, if you have an order, I'm sure Diane won't turn you away tonight if you decide you want to give it to her while you're here. So thank you so much, Ryan. I hope you spurred some ideas for growing some more plants and shrubs, trees and shrubs. So thank you for coming. This was great.